And then let me share my screen. Someday I'll understand all of this. Okay, because I'm recording, my name's Paul Szymanski, and I'm going to talk to you about outer space warfare, something I've been doing actually for 48 years now. And I usually talk about how to fight and how to win a space war. But today is special. We're going to talk about how to lose a space war, and I'll illustrate one major war that was lost and what are some of the principles. So actually what I'm going to talk to you today about as a summary, I'll just talk a little bit about myself so you know where I'm coming from. I'm going to look at the past history of space warfare. It does have a history, which is interesting. And then go over some of the basic principles of how to fight and win space wars. And then specifically, I am going to talk about the space war that happened over the Ukrainian conflict in 2014, talk about some of the lessons learned from that, and then update on what's been happening now in Ukraine in space. So a little bit about me, 48 years experience in the, the policy, doctrine, strategies, and all that. 37 of those years were in space weapons programs. And I've published, lectured over 94 times in the last few years alone in this special area. In Aviation Week, various publications, U.S. allied nations, where mostly by Zoom, but sometimes I've physically gone there. I was invited to France for a week last November by the Air and Space Force and the IESD is a think tank there in Lyon. So I talk about a lot of this now. I'm retired, so I don't have any security clearances or anything. That all timed out. So every statement I'm making in this briefing, I can trace back to open sources and sort of my interpretation of the public events that are happening because I have such experience in there. And then I want to mention too, I have a space warfare discussion group on LinkedIn, close to 21,000 members, again, unclassified discussion on policy and things like that. There's over 2,000 general officers and admirals on that. A whole bunch of people, Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Defense. I have two former secretaries of the Air Force as part of that group, congressional staffers, over 300 from the White House, and National Security Council staffs, which my brother actually used to work at, even 64 different astronauts. And then, I've been around the block. These are all the different organizations I've supported over the years. Starting with the National Security Council, I worked for the Secretary of the Air Force at the Pentagon in my 20s, and then diligently worked my way downward, ended up in the Space and Missile Systems Center, or SSC now, in LA. And then the last 28 years at Air Force Research Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which for some of you people, New Mexico is where you have the Billy the Kid and Breaking Bad and all those kind of funny things happening. And then, there's all these different projects I've worked on over the years, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, a lot of places. And then a lot of people appear to like my work. I've gotten nothing but good comments on it. Because, I've been working this so long, I guess I have a lot of opinions on it. And it's suddenly become very important. And it's funny too, because, having worked this for so long, there's usually 2 or 3 job announcements a year for my kind of work, operations research, and analysis, and so forth. And now there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of job announcements and billions of dollars more going into space warfare. And that could make one think that there must be something up in space. There's certainly a big concern for the Space Force, not only in this country, but the UK and various other organizations. France and all have their Air and Space Force. There were some big things that happened that actually the French told me what happened. But at any rate, let me give you a general introduction to space warfare. And I love this quote from Churchill, who's, from, I don't know, 60, 70 years ago, says you could take the most gallant sailor, the most intrepid airman, or the most audacious soldiers, no guardians yet. You put them together at a table, and what do you get? The sum of their fears. Where, I want to emphasize that it doesn't matter if war is ancient Greek warfare, World War II, Desert Storm, futuristic space warfare. It's all still human-based in one form or the other. We don't have artificial intelligence sufficient to have things fighting out in space on their own, without some kind of human intervention, if you even would want them doing things on their own. So what's the nature of space warfare? Space, mostly, if not 100%, it generates information or transmits that information. So imagery, weather, navigational information is being generated. Communication satellites are transmitting it, missile warning satellites and all this stuff. So when you're really thinking about it, it's actually information warfare when you're, talking about space. And there's no colonies in space. You're not up there defending them. You're really providing information to people on Earth in one form or another. Now, you have to be able to defend your ability to do that. So you might have to do things against adversaries in space, but it's sort of different in the ground. The ground, the Army, it's like, we'll take out this bridge and that will delay forces 6 hours from attacking, and they can even calculate the amount of casualties are lower because of it, or, the war ends 3 days earlier because of it and all that. But for space, the trouble is it's all information. So you take out this satellite, what have you done? And, I took out this imagery satellite, so now the adversary commander is not able to make a correct decision, maybe. He attacks left versus attacking right. How do you measure that? How do you measure, well, I've got an extra $100 million or two, and should I put up this constellation of cool military satellites, or should I equip and train a new Army division? And people in Washington, at the Pentagon, or around the world essentially have to make that kind of decisions that, people in the Space Force and people in the Army all think they're very important and they need their money and stuff like that. But how do you calculate the fact that if I spend money in space, I've won this space war, or I've won the war on the ground, or there's fewer casualties, something like that, where the Army and the Air Force are more used to sort of figuring that out. So it's harder to understand, and it's hard to understand of well, how do you define winning a space war? The on the ground, it's like, well, we capture the adversary capital, we change the government, we destroy their war-making material or stuff. These are maybe goals that you could have. But in space, do you capture territory? Do you capture leadership? And so how do you define it? And it's conceivable that both sides can claim they won the space war. One side says, I took out all your imagery satellites, I won. And the other side says, I took out all your communication satellites, I won. Well, what's more important for that battlefield, in that particular battlefield? One might be more important in Europe and the other more important in Asia, depending on maybe the military culture that you're facing and things like that. So it's a harder thing to kind of figure out and fund. And then getting back to this concept that all warfare is between human minds, and it's adversary commander's mind against the adversary commander, the other adversary's mind. And you're, dealing with their their training, their culture, their experience, their fears, their energy levels, whatever. And you're still talking about human mind versus human mind. And you use military equipment and soldiers and sailors and guardians to transmit will and resolve on the adversary commander. And ultimately, there's 3 phases of warfare. The first phase is pre-conflict, where, well, someday we probably go to war, and these are probable adversaries, and it might be in this part of the world versus this part. And we better fund a military to do this, this, and that. And so you're planning for some war that hasn't happened yet. And it depends where you're deploying that equipment and so forth, and how fast you can get things there. And, you know, all of these variables matter very much during the actual phase of conflict. Now, I've realized too, you're not fighting the war during the actual conflict phase. You're fighting the peace. You're fighting the geopolitical alignment, which is part of your goals in one sense or another. So you have to think about that. And there's things like, gee, I won the space war. Look I destroyed all the adversaries' space gear, you know. And then you say, well, you won the battle, but you lost the war because you created all this debris fields, and now all your allies are mad at you, you know. Or let's say you lost the space war, and suddenly some country like China might think, oh, well, I guess the US wasn't as strong as we thought. And smaller countries around them might say, well, maybe being an ally of the US wasn't all that great. We should sidle up to China now. You know, like Thailand is doing, surprisingly, holding joint military exercises with China. So, you know, it's all about the geopolitics, ultimately. And then I want to emphasize, you know, I mentioned ancient Greek warfare. Well, you look at Polybius more than 2,000 years ago, and he's stating the same thing. The whole objective of war is not to annihilate those who have given provocation for it, but to cause them to mend their ways. You know, ultimately, that's what it's all about. And then I like this quote from Trotsky from over 100 years ago, that there's a lot of people who say, oh, we don't want to go to war in space. Oh, that's terrible. Let's keep weapons away from there. And Trotsky is saying here, well, yeah, you're not interested in war, but war is interested in you. And it's certainly just going to bite you. And if you're, you know, putting your head in the sand and saying, oh, you know, nothing's going to go wrong on all that, space is way too obscure, tens of thousands of kilometers away. It's too difficult to see what's happening there to know. And most space wars will be over with in 24 to 48 hours. So, you know, situational awareness is everything, but you've got to really understand what an adversary is capable of doing. And you've got to do something about a potential war in space, and not even potential. My estimates are they've been about 10 space wars since the 1970s, or at least major incidents and attacks in space. And that's part of the other side of the coin here. It's very confusing in space, very difficult to determine what's happening. There's not big red stars painted on the side of anti-satellite satellites, you know, that are attacking you. There's probably, even if you inspected it afterwards, 90% of the parts are Western source parts and stuff. You know, it's very hard to figure all that out on what's happening. So what I'm saying here is space is too important for the United States and other countries to ignore, and it's going to happen whether you like it or not. And so space is confusing, but the other beauty, in some sense, is the fact that, well, I've realized over the years that countries are just like children. They'll do anything they want if they can get away with it from their parents. And, you know, countries do anything they want in space if people can't, you know, people on the ground, normal people like you and I, can't figure out what's happening. You could look at the Falklands Islands conflict from years ago. did Britain really care about those islands? They had no economic value or anything. It was all kind of an ego thing. The populace got upset. We have to do something about it. So in some sense, space is another rung on a conflict escalation ladder where you can show resolve and intent and, force your will, so to speak, on other people without the general populace getting all upset and driving you to war. And so it's kind of good as a safety valve or something to be able to show these things. And I'll go over how the 2014 space war affected space potential for space war today over the whole Ukrainian issues. So it's an important, almost diplomatic tool for direct country to country, government to government communications. And the governments are happy not to say anything about it to the general public. And this isn't necessarily just true of space. I hear there was some major incidents between submarines, an American and a Russian submarine in the Sea of Japan several months back. And that's all you hear. You don't know what that was about or anything like that. And if you believe the Hollywood movies, there's this spy versus spy thing going on. And there's at CIA headquarters, this whole wall commemorating all the spies who died and all that. So this whole thing back and forth between countries going on that we're all happy, to sit here, fat, dumb, and happy, and, not know about all these bad things that are happening weekly, I'm sure. So, yeah, there's a lot of ways you can mess with satellites. I'm not going to go through all the details on this, but if you have, let's say, a satellite in orbit, and these are all sort of fake satellites. I have software that automatically generates new basic encyclopedia numbers and names for satellites and things like that. But you could have this satellite sitting in orbit, but there's a lot of different ways. The latest in thing are inspector satellites. Everyone around the block has to have them. Russia, China, the US, who knows who else, that go around and get up close and personal to a satellite. And this is important for, the more you understand your adversary, maybe the higher the chance that peace holds, so to speak. So you might want to get close to a satellite and see if there are, let's say, secret doors on the side, which maybe a space mine can come out. Is there some sort of laser blinder, low power on there? What's really the frequencies of its antennas and size of its optics? And I mean, there's all kinds of interesting things you can figure out besides looking at its vulnerabilities. If you want to shoot a laser from the ground, you need to know the materials on that satellite. And then, now you call them inspector satellites, but even NASA and companies have what they call servicing or maintenance satellites, and they have manipulator arms that come out and can grab a satellite and things like that. And they, to me, having one of these servicing satellites, in one sense, is an ideal anti-satellite, ASAT, because it's like taking a satellite and putting it in a wheelbarrow, so to speak, and wheeling it into your garage and going at it. Let's drill a hole here, let's cut this wire, let's saw this, let's bend this. You could do anything you really want. Now, the disadvantage is artificial intelligence isn't enough for this servicing satellite to do it on its own. You have to have an operator on the ground, something that might take hours, and a satellite's going to pass overhead in 5 to 7 minutes. So you need to be able to control that manipulator satellite for a long time, and usually use a relay satellite to bounce a signal if it's low Earth or a medium Earth orbits. And geosynchronous, you maybe can get away with just having the controller there for hours. And there's all sorts of theoretical laser anti-satellites, actual space mines that might have cyber attacks or actually just blow up and all that. And they like to think that really there's 3 parts of a satellite system. You got the satellite you can attack, but if you seal off the Earth let's say, an adversary's ability to communicate to his satellites, and the satellites are worthless to him. So if you can get to the ground terminals, special forces, blow them up, cyber attacks, things like that. So they like to think of, you can either go against the satellite, against the ground terminals, or against the links between them. And then there's also other kinds of possible attacks that if you can get into the whole manufacturing network and put in different kinds of cyber kinds of Trojan horses and chips that you turn on 10 years later and all that is, certainly an issue, since a lot of this stuff is made in China and elsewhere. You're not really sure what's going in there. So history of space warfare. Well, ancient history again. The Romans, Lucian's True History talked about Roman legions attacking the moon. So, that's at least been in the imagination for a while. I guess they had giant spiders or something like that in the book. And then even just at the dawn of the space age, this is like a year after the first satellite launch by Russia. This is a famous illustrator who has this space plane attacking a satellite. It certainly is in the imagination of a lot of people. But even in the 50s and 60s, there were different nuclear anti-satellites and others that could go up. I have a piece of computer gear from the Project 437. Johnston Island was a nuclear ASAT against potential space systems. The Russians had their anti-aircraft cannon on their Almaz. You could look that up online, I'm not really sure the physics of that. Because if something's coming at you and you shoot at it and blow it up, all the pieces are still coming at you like a shotgun pellet. So, maybe that wouldn't have worked too well. And then when I was at the Pentagon, I was in the F-15 anti-satellite program. The program element monitor told me they considered it just a negotiating chip with the Russians. They had some tests, made some debris like India has recently. And then you had the classic Russian kinetic anti-satellite system, which again was kind of a shotgun pellet thing, direct descent it was called, from a missile. And then there's been a lot of concepts, and these are Russian pictures of ground-based lasers, or maybe again, looks like the Frank Tinsley thing of some sort of space plane concept attacking satellites. And then you have to think of the bigger picture. There's many ways to get at satellites. And so if you take out the ground system, which the US did in Desert Storm, took out all the heavy Earth terminals in Iraq, here's results of one of them, maybe you've denied it. Now I say maybe because especially these commercial systems like the imagery satellite systems being used in Ukraine now, they're commercial. Well, if you go back to Iraq, if you took out the ground terminals, well, that same, I think the French Spot satellite was their imagery satellite back then. That information could have been downlinked in Thailand and gone over submarine cables into Iraq and all that. So you have to think of that bigger picture. And I was good friends many years ago with the Navy captain who was in charge of Schwarzkopf's Desert Storm intel staff. And he claimed Schwarzkopf put the French special forces on the leftmost of the left hook to make them most vulnerable so that they would turn off their spot imagery satellite. So the Iraqis couldn't see us coming, sneaking around in the desert. So for what that's worth, and that's a different kind of space war, kind of diplomatic or extortion or something like that. Okay, actual attack incidents. Now, in the late 70s, early 80s, again, I was working at the Pentagon, and we were very interested in satellite survivability. And there's a place in Laurel, Maryland, I don't know if it's still there, but the Federal Communication Commission had a bunch of satellite antennas and terminals and so forth. and they were monitoring signal interference and stuff like that. And when I went there, they told me that in the 1960s, a rather unimaginatively named satellite called ComSat, US satellite, was jammed for several days. And what they would do is move the attitude of the satellite so the antenna was pointed different ways to see where they were getting the highest power from the signal. And they say, well, it's coming from off the East Coast. So they assumed there was some sort of Russian trawler there jamming the US satellite. For what reason? I don't know. You know, that getting back to obscurity of space, I can sit here and say, well, look at these funny things that happened, but who knows what, why, who, you know, and I don't think, no pun intended, these things happen in a vacuum. There's something else happening on Earth that causes an adversary to maybe attack a satellite to show, you know, well, we really mean it now, you know, you better back off, which has worked in the past. I'll go over that. Another mystery satellite, CSAT, NASA satellite, US, measuring wave height. Not even sure why. I guess it's somehow for weather, but I guess a radar beam. And when I was in my 20s, we hired a former NASA employee, and this guy told me that when NASA turned on CSAT, they said, oh my gosh, we can detect nuclear submarines at operating depth. And so there'd be I guess even though they're, you know, hundreds of feet under the water, it still makes a little bit of a ripple that goes for miles. And so there's a big arrow pointing to where the submarine is. And it negated 1/3 of the US triad for nuclear forces, supposedly. And you can go online, look this up, and they call it a conspiracy theory one way or the other. But when I was working decades later, CSAT was a favorite for satellite imaging projects. This is a picture from the ground looking up at the CSAT. And all those pictures you look at, you see the satellite's all bent out of shape. Now, this guy from NASA says NASA purposely turned it off because of its threat to the military and faked its death. But it appeared to me that somebody had attacked it and kind of blew it up one way or the other. So for what that's worth, and these are all mysterious, let's say. Sooner or later, I'll get to the big one where I can mathematically prove the war happened. And in the mid-1980s, there was a whole bunch of satellites being launched, missiles being launched into space, Russian, US, and none of them could make it to orbit. They just would start falling into the brink. And it just seemed awfully suspicious that for 6-8 months, nobody could launch a satellite. And it looked like it was a tit for tat. They were attacking them. I mean, people have said, go to have a boat off Cape Canaveral and a high-powered rifle, and you could take out the very thin skin of the rockets being launched. And also, I don't know about that. There was a definite event in the 2010s. I can't get into details, but the rumor was a drunken Russian colonel started it, for what that's worth. And then I've heard another one in 2014 that somehow NOAA satellites in the South Pacific were attacked, cyber attack from China. And there's a bunch of information on the internet on that. Again, I don't know why they would do that if it was not in response to something else. I will go in detail in this briefing about the attacks on the Russian GLONASS navigation satellites in 2014. And then if you really think about the politics, let's say in the United States, in Congress, the Democrats and Republicans couldn't agree on anything, but suddenly they readily agreed about, oh, we have to establish a US Space Force. And, I mentioned earlier, suddenly all these new job announcements and billions of dollars. And also there must have been something that preceded that caused this to occur. And actually the French told me last year what that was, but I won't talk about it online here. And it looks like losing people and re-emitting them, and I don't know what's going on here, but hopefully we still have people online. Now, let me see my time frame. We're doing good. There's kind of a Hollywood interpretation of space. Oh, you just blow it up. Well, people, at least in the United States, are sensitive about debris generation. And I think even China now had some issues when they generated some debris a few years back. So there's always been a talk, there's actually different degrees of attacking, and it's good that we're thinking about this. Let me see, I gotta admit somebody else. And so there's something called disrupt, and that means that it's a temporary kind of attack, and it's only partial impairment of what you're attacking. So you might jam just one channel of a communication satellite. I mean, the military uses a lot of international and commercial satellites. So they, at least years ago, when they were running drones in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're being run out of Creech Air Force Base in Las Vegas, Nevada, they would bounce the signal via Intelsat, an international telecommunications satellite system owned by a whole bunch of countries. So let's say your adversary was using that. You don't want to just blow up the satellite, it would be a major diplomatic incident. You get a lot of people mad at you, you'd have to pay for it or all that. You don't want to deny all channels, the communication channels. You want to just deny the one the adversary is using, but not the one you're using, or not the one that's being used by diplomatic staff who might want to negotiate a peace later. You got to think all those through. So you got to do it partially, and then, for a few hours, a few days, temporary. Now, the next level of severity is, well, it's still temporary, but fully taking out the capability of that satellite. And that might be a blinding laser, so that they can't see too well what's happening on the battlefield. Besides seeing that, well, you've got this laser down there blinding me, I could see it's taking out these few pixels, so maybe I should target it, unless you really have blooming effects that would take out the whole system. And then you get to what's called degrade. There's a permanent effect, but it's still partial. So maybe you had an EMP weapon or something that took out parts of the satellite, or you degraded the imagery capabilities with a laser where, okay, some of the screen, the pixels are damaged, but not all of it, things like that. And then the old classic, destroy everything. The satellite doesn't work, all parts of it doesn't work, it'll never work again. You've really done the job. And then there's things of, well, sort of a temporary thing, but maybe you're just delaying the usefulness of the information. If somebody's about to make an attack and they want to know, should I attack left or right? And you blind their imagery sensor, and he doesn't get that information until another satellite comes over that you can't so easily blind, but it's kind of too late. The attack's already started, And then there's the classic deception of, maybe there's a way to put false information in there. Maybe there's funny business that, if one could be biased and say, well, a lot of these potential adversaries are dictatorships, and there's a bunch of old fogies running them, and they're very traditional oriented, and they don't really believe in this newfangled space stuff and all that. And so they launch a new satellite, and it's not wartime, but you do kind of temporary cyber attacks on it, so that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It shows false information sometimes. And so the leadership doesn't believe their system when they really need to believe it during a critical time in a conflict. And then the other subtleties you have to understand is what's called non-attribution. And that's easy to get away with in space. If you're talking about on Earth, and you got this fighter aircraft that shoots down another adversary aircraft, well, there's evidence on the ground, debris. They can find pieces of the missile and look at the serial numbers and figure it out. Oh, it's in the Cyrillic, it must be this or all that. But in space, you really, I guess you could send an inspector satellite in, but that takes up a lot of fuel and things like that. And then what exactly are you going to see? Can you really determine? And you can sit there. See, the trouble is you're, let's say in a command center at 3 a.m. in the morning, and suddenly a satellite blinks out. Well, I have a story. I've several times been in the Norridge Mountain Complex in Colorado, deep underground kind of thing. And sitting there waiting for a nuclear war. And I asked the captain there and said, well, if your communication cuts off, what do you do? Is that, klaxon bells ring and you're like, oh my gosh, we're going to raise the escalation level and this and that. And he says, no, we just call Ma Bell and see what the issue is, So for space, suddenly a satellite doesn't work. Okay, well, maybe a solar flare increased radiation and it died. And sometimes my computer doesn't work. And sometimes my stereo, after a few years, breaks just on its own. Cosmic rays and stuff like that. Maybe a meteor hit it, meteorite. How can you tell? How can you validate that in one way or the other? And then you can sit there and say, yeah, that was human caused, but was it intentional? Was it accidental? And then the most difficult thing to figure in all militaries, whether space or ground, is adversary intent. Are they just showing you resolve? Are they trying to take out your command and control? Decapitation attack, they're called. What exactly are they trying to do? So maybe you figured, okay, this was intentional. It was human caused. We can kind of see this anti-satellite came at me and then suddenly it stopped working afterwards. But the problem is, well, who did it? Non-attribution. And if you're sitting there and, oh, we're at war with China now over Straits of Taiwan, and suddenly our satellite stops working, well, you could just sit there and say, oh, those Chinese, they did it. Or who knows if it's maybe the Russians stirring the pot or Iranians or who knows what, And from what I've heard, the national command authorities are not going to authorize an attack against a satellite, a counterattack, unless they know who did it, And I have this whole book of satellite failures, and it goes through, this satellite broke and all that. And all of them, it takes months to figure out what happened. And you're not really sure anyway. You're just sort of estimating because nobody's there looking at it, kicking the satellite to see if it's jingling around inside or something like that. So if you had a space war, and my calculations have, I've done simulations. I've taken 100 random satellites and said, match the orbits of another 100 random satellites. And, I went through the delta V fuel and the calculations and all this. And 96% of them matched their targets, in other words, attacked them within 24 hours. So if suddenly there's a space war and all your capabilities being taken out, you really don't have time to react. If you don't have space situational awareness, space domain awareness, do you really know what to do about it? And I don't even know if you can maneuver out of the way in time. And they have all these things of, this satellite's coming in close. It's taking days or hours to get close to me, and it might attack me over the next orbit. They might happen over Antarctica. And when the satellite comes back over my radars, maybe I'll see debris, or maybe it's spinning wildly. You can go through all those things, but you're not really sure of what's happening. And then sort of the match set to non-attribution is plausible deniability. That, well, I didn't do it, prove it. And I've been on programs where you don't brief the president, so he could just sit there and say, gee, I don't know, it wasn't my fault. There's programs where maybe the Air Force knows what happened, but they're not going to tell the Army or the Navy. They're certainly not going to tell the State Department. For years, I've been telling the military that we really ought to get the State Department involved in these weapon development programs, because ultimately you're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and then when you you want to actually employ it against a target, that's a major political thing to do. So you're going to need NCA, National Command Authorities, and State Department approval, I'm sure, in some sort of sense. And if you involved them earlier, they might say, well, if you just tweak this a little bit early on, it'd be more acceptable to us 10 years later when you want to use it. And I always got pushback, say, oh, we don't want those State Department people. We don't trust them. And it's funny, last month I was talking to a former undersecretary of the State Department, and he says they were right. He says he was in the treaty negotiating bureau of the State Department. He says they never saw a treaty for space warfare that they didn't like, that they would just accept anything on them. So he didn't trust him either. So that, all governments are like that. They don't trust each other one way or the other. And then I've also mentioned the non-public aspect, and that's very important, that, people aren't cruising around in their spaceships up there in space and saying, oh, look at this satellite just got attacked. What was that all about? You can get away with a lot, I guess I'm essentially saying. Okay, so I'm still in the phase of talking about general things about space and space warfare. So I think there's a fatal misconception happening in a lot of space forces, and that is they just keep thinking tactically that, oh, here's this satellite coming up close to me, I have to defend, or I have to do this or that. So the trouble is space is global. You have a satellite up there, it's going all over the Earth. So there's actually many points of application of space weapons all around the world, and you're not going to know all of them. So you have to think of that globally. You have to think strategically, because any satellite you attack maybe over your country is probably going to affect space services in another country or create debris or something like that. So everything is strategic, and people are unfortunately kind of used to warfare in the ground. They're not used to warfare in space. And so any sort of major space warfare that the public gets familiar with are going to have major political implications and allied realignments, and I don't know, fall of governments, but you can get in a lot of trouble with that. That's why there's a certain beauty of keeping things quiet about what's happening in space. And in some sense, in my opinion, there's a lot of people who say, oh, we don't want war in space. And they're the same people who say, we don't want war in Antarctica. And they think, well, there's nobody living there. That's a perfect place to have war. You're not blowing up cities or people and all. And the same with space. Oh, well, so you got rid of billions of dollars of space gear, and maybe there's issues with debris, so let's ban debris-causing weapons like the US did. But you're not killing anybody. There's no colonies in space. And if you really think about it, if would, let's say, the United States go to war if it didn't have its space assets? If it's got these carrier battle groups thousands of miles away from the United States central CONUS, and let's say it's in the Western Pacific, how are they going to attack aircraft, navigate around sand batteries if it doesn't have GPS, if it doesn't have imagery to see where those sand batteries are, where the target is, or if it needs to be serviced again because you didn't blow it up good enough? You didn't have communication back to the United States, or even communication to your fighter aircraft if you don't have satellites to bounce them off. Would you even go to war? And so a war in space might prevent a war on the ground. Now, another way of looking at it, space is kind of different in that people keep getting worried about, well, this satellite's coming close to mine. Well, you have to define closeness in a different way. For example, like the Apollo astronauts had trouble when they were trying to rendezvous with another space object, and they say, well, it's right there in front of me, let me step on the gas. Well, if you step on the gas and you increase the amount of energy, Well, the thing's going to go into higher orbit. It's not going to get closer to it necessarily. So you have to think differently. And I define closeness as the amount of delta V fuel and the amount of time it takes two objects to get close to each other, match orbits or whatever. So according to that definition, an object on the entirely other side of the Earth is close to that first object. If it's at the same altitude and inclination, all it has to do is a phasing burn to get close to it. So you have to think different of what a threat is. So again, you have to expand your mindset in a global strategic way, not necessarily a tactical way. And then I have a whole briefing on how to hide satellites. And satellites now, some of these are about the size of a soccer ball. You know, they can be, especially if you're an anti-satellite that it's a single use and it doesn't have, it's just on batteries and, you know, it's all good for a few hours and that's it. If you told someone, take this soccer ball and bounce it somewhere on Earth and then challenge someone to find it, it's like, well, that's just impossible. Well, it's the same as this soccer ball size satellite in orbit that, you know, it's 4 pi r. It's like thousands of times more, if not millions, especially if you're talking from the Earth to the moon, more space to be able to see it. And, you know, you can't hide it behind a mountain or trees or anything like that. But it's very easy to hide satellites. There's a 1970s patent, US patent for a stealth satellite. Go look it up. It looks like a barbell, you know. I've seen a study called Smart Attitude, where if you see a satellite's basically a box, can be a box, and the sun bounces off one side and hits the Earth. Well, if you just change the attitude, that makes sure all those solar speculars, the bouncing light, just bounce back off into space, you're suddenly at 18th magnitude for brightness. And you mostly detect satellites optically. The radars only go several thousand miles and that's it. And then you've probably heard of RAM, radar absorptive material. Well, a few years back, NASA invented optical absorptive material. So you combine these various things. You combine techniques like odd orbits, like the US has trouble tracking Molniya Russian satellites because they're highly inclined, highly eccentric orbits. It's very difficult to find those. We've lost satellites for years until the Russians announced where they're at. If you started doing that purposely and you add on low observables, you add on, let's say, electric thrusting, which some European satellites, Gochi, I think it was thrusting for 2.5 years continuously. Suddenly, you don't have Keplerian orbital dynamics, the thing's going different weird ways. And then there's this whole mystery about the moon where the US is really interested in fighting around the moon. I don't know why. But you're talking about the three-body problem suddenly. There's supposedly all kinds of squirrely orbits that occur that you can't, you know, they go different ways and all that. And so you could probably play that game too. So to my mind, it's very easy to hide a satellite. If you put anti-satellites at Lagrangian points where equal gravitational potential from the Earth, the moon, sun, and all that, where the satellite just sort of sits there way up in tens of thousands of kilometers, if not hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, and you're at the top of the gravity well. The Earth is the gravity, and if you just notch it over a little bit, just kick it a little bit, it'll come screaming back down to Earth, and maybe attack, let's say, your geosynchronous satellites coming in, and you're not going to see those coming in. So there's just a lot of ways to do that. And then the other thing is, oh, well, we've got all these cool space defense capabilities and our allies in NATO and Europe do. Well, satellites that are covering Europe, that are optimized for Europe, especially geosynchronous, it takes days and weeks to maneuver those, and you use up maybe 80% of your fuel to maneuver them, let's say, over to the Pacific. If you got a war in the Pacific. So if a war is over with in 24 hours, you really cannot maneuver fast enough to be able to, get out of the way, to help or anything. So you essentially fight with what you got in the position you got. And that's the thing. Well, should you set up for a war in Europe, a war in the Pacific? How fast do you think a war would happen? How good do you think your space situational awareness is in warning and all of this stuff? So it's a complex problem. And getting back to space being kind of different from the ground, you cannot maneuver a satellite anywhere in its orbit. If you want to attack a certain other satellite, there's only certain key places that you can start thrusting and maneuver out of the way. So essentially, there are key choke points in space that if you want to attack an adversary's key military space assets, you have to clump together at these choke points and take weeks to build up your forces there to make the attack. And there's two kinds of attacks, and they're kind of mutually exclusive. You can have these satellites in the key choke points start maneuvering all at once, but they'll reach their targets at different times, or you can have them start maneuvering at different times and they'll reach their targets simultaneously for maximum, confusion and things like that. So if you saw these potential threatening satellites build up in these choke points, any adversary, let's say, wants to go against the United States on the ground, is going to attack the eyes and ears and space of the United States first, before so the US can't see the maneuver of forces and ships and things like that on the ground if they no longer have imagery and the signals intelligence satellites. So if you can detect this buildup, which will happen before the war on the ground, you might be able to frustrate it with your own attacks, or just go to the United Nations and say, hey, it looks like this adversary is building up to attack us in space, which means they're about to attack on the ground. Fair warning. And so maybe, again, a war in space might prevent war on the ground. And then I just want to mention, let's see, how much time we got? Doing good. There's various ways to attack satellites or attack space systems. Really, it's a whole system, the satellite, the ground, and the data centers that process the information from the satellite, the raw data and all that. But there's diplomatic, economic. You could attempt to limit your country's development. This is what Russia and China were trying to do with the United States over the decades, saying, well, you want an anti-satellite treaty ban and all this. At the same time, they were developing their own space weapons. You could do, all kinds of economic attacks, like what we're doing with Russia now and so forth. There's all kinds of jamming or spoofing. You can even maybe hijack the satellite. This is a picture of a theoretical high-powered microwave satellite weapon. It's a sticky bomb. They would stick on the sides. Though I would think satellites are exquisitely balanced. If you just put a weight on the side, maybe even a moving weight, you would really mess up that satellite, because it has to precisely point to the Earth for its imagery or its communication and things like that. So those are the kinds of things you can do without creating space debris. These are just showing you some like a ground-based laser here in New Mexico, the result of a laser attack where you're taking out a few pixels, but you still can see other things unless you really get the power up and melt it. This theoretical attack, a space-based laser and so forth. And so there's lots of things you can do cyber-wise or directed energy-wise. And the French proudly told me about their mobile laser blinder that can, I presume, do pictures like this or do them in. And they said, well, we can turn up the power and actually melt the pixels, the CCDs and so forth in the satellite. And then there's the physical attacks, terrestrial, iron bombs on target, like in Desert Storm, maybe special forces where, they're thinking about that. And then there's a space base. Classically, it was called a kinetic kill vehicle. This is what Russia did a few months back before the February attack in Ukraine. They did a demonstration to threaten the United States not to attack them again like they did in 2014. And as far as I can tell, maybe that was effective. These are potential kinetic kill vehicles in space. These are all theoretical. This was an actual program. Well, I was on the F-15 ASAT program. These are others that I don't think ever came to fruition. That might have been more of an inspector maintenance satellite. This grab satellites and pull into useful or useless orbits. Well, there's another funny story. A few months back, the Chinese Badao navigation satellite, one of the Chinese servicing inspector maintenance satellite, what do you want to call it, had manipulator arms, and it grabbed this theoretically non-functioning Badao navigation satellite that was in geosynchronous orbit and pulled it out to graveyard orbit, and this is what the press says. They said, oh, this poor Chinese Badao satellite broke right after it was launched, and it was drifting around there, and we wanted to get out of it before it hit another satellite, and it all sounds innocent. Well, I sort of know where the skeletons are buried, and I'm thinking, now, first of all, they claim they pulled it into graveyard orbit. Graveyard orbit is about 300 kilometers plus or minus above and below geosynchronous. They pulled it to 3,000 kilometers above. So that's a lot of extra fuel, extra time, and it's sort of, well, why? And the US will proudly tell you about the 6 inspector satellites they have, and they were launching 2 new inspector satellites. And 2 days after they launched these satellites, suddenly China felt a big need to pull this Badao satellite out of orbit, which appeared to me is to get it away from the US inspector satellites because it had evil intent. And it obviously was something that they faked the death. I don't know for the fact, but I've worked with these guys. They faked the death of the satellite after launch. And it was an inspector satellite drifting around the geo belt. Maybe had weapons on it or just inspection thing, I don't know. And the reason I say that is I was on the very same program 35 years ago to do the very same thing. They never did it, but they spent, millions of dollars thinking about it at least. So there's kind of nothing new under the sun. And this other thing of paint satellite systems, you could do some paint that sublimates with the sun that slowly peels off with time. So if you want a temporary effect, sensors aren't going to work if you painted them. If you painted the radiators that are, pointing out to deep space, you probably can overheat the satellite. Paint maybe the antennas and their, RF figure would be way off and things. So you could kind of mess with things like that. Paint solar panels, and I saw yet another study where if you painted just one small corner of a solar panel, one of these huge geosynchronous communication satellites, there'd be a difference in solar pressure enough to make the satellite slowly start spinning out faster and faster with time. And spinning is really bad in space, uncontrolled spinning, because it would start flying apart. They even worry about that with astronauts. If they have no way to stop spinning, they would start, falling apart themselves. So there's a lot of different things. And these are pictures I drew of potential manipulator satellites. This is, I think, some NASA one. This is, again, a picture I did of 2 manipulator satellites fighting it out in space. There's another, I think it's a commercial thing of, the manipulator arms. That looks more like picking up debris, that last one. Okay, so what are the foundational principles of space wars? What are the things that I think are the most important? and I've kind of intimated to this, is space situational awareness, space domain awareness. And it's not only sensors collecting this data, it's intelligently processing it and doing something with it. You know, especially if someone can be close to you, so to speak, on the other side of the earth, how do you sort of present that to commanders to understand the kind of weird things in space and what's only going on? So, and situational awareness, of course, is true even on the ground and throughout history and so forth. There's so many battles that are lost because you just didn't know what's going on. But I think it's even worse in space because surprise is so easy. You can't really see things coming at you until it's too late. And then I already mentioned the pre-conflict positioning. You only fight with what you got in sort of the local theater. You don't have time to maneuver. However, if you got a lot of extra maneuvering fuel and you really want to put the pedal to the metal or whatever, you can keep maybe get away from attacking satellites, or maybe start maneuvering on warning of war and confuse all the algorithms for the space surveillance calculations being done on the ground, because you're maneuvering randomly. They can't track you, especially if you maneuver like over Antarctica or South Atlantic or places where there's no space surveillance assets to see what you're doing. And I know a lot of the space people say, oh, we know where everything's at in space. They say, well, we saw it launch and we tracked it this and that and all that. And I think they're really fooling themselves. That there's all kinds of mystery things that could happen. And this is a screenshot. Well, this is a calculation I did years ago, number of missing objects by orbit. But this is another screenshot that if you go to the spacetrack.com, sign up, you can get all of the orbital dynamics for satellites, all objects, alive or dead, and download the, well, I call them the 2-card element sets. That's because I'm an old fogey from the time there actually were two 80-column wide IBM cards. I think they're called 2-line element sets now. And the statistics here are telling you almost half of all the space objects out there are classified as analyst objects. And the definition of analyst object is, we don't know where they're at. We don't know what they do. We know where they're at. We don't know what they do, what country owns them, and things like that. In other words, half of that up there is a big mystery. And there's all kinds of things like if you had a 0-degree inclined LEO, low Earth orbit, anti-satellite system, it's not going to cross paths with any space surveillance assets on the ground. And all you have to do is increase its altitude, and you can match anything in LEO orbit without anyone seeing it coming. I think another technique is you have these spent rocket stages from the 60s, 70s, 80s between low Earth orbit and geosynchronous. They were in transfer orbit, and the satellite, you know, kept going, and they just stood there. Stood there in orbit. The exhaust cones of those things are about the size of the rooms. You know, you could hide a satellite in there for years and have it come out again when it's over some place where there's no space surveillance assets, and come and attack things. And no one's going to use up all the fuel inspecting all these spent stages that, you know, could even purposely have anti-satellites built inside of them, just waiting for the time when you really need to do it. Okay. Now, there's space escalation issues, and I already mentioned that space provides additional rungs on the conflict escalation ladder, and that's kind of good. You know, you don't have to go to nuclear war. You could do something else. You don't have to, if you've got some conflict in some small region on Earth, maybe you don't have to expand it. You can show resolve through space, and maybe kind of deal with the government communications there. So I've already mentioned space as the mystery. And then there's a certain degree of acceptability already too. that everyone accepts satellites coming over their territory. You can't really stop it. That's just the way the physics is. They don't accept some adversaries' aircraft coming over their territory. So that's kind of good. You can kind of, use your sensors to detect military buildup and keep things steadier. And then I've mentioned this time and time again, it's like a forum where adversaries can show an intent, a safety valve. And when you think about it, during the old Cold War, 60s, 70s, where you'd have Russian destroyers cutting off American destroyers, sometimes maybe accidentally hitting them and all that. There was this tit for tat and, pressuring, having aircraft go through air defense zones of an adversary country to see what radars light up and how long does it take them to do something about it. I mean, they were testing all the time. Well, I think the same thing is happening in space, especially the inspector satellites. Testing the envelope, pushing the envelope, trying to figure out what's threats, what isn't, trying to figure out, well, can they see us coming or do they react? How do they react? Can I insert this cyber code in without them knowing and then years later access it and make that satellite not work anymore? There's a lot of different things one could possibly do. Now, I'm not sure about this. If you had a war in space, would that cause a war on the ground? Or a war on the ground that causes war in space? Both probably can happen. So one has to really think that through. And that's why I've been saying, we really need some sort of space warfare think tank to get senior kinds of people in to start discussing these things. Because I think space forces are too enamored with the equipment. And, oh, look at this really cool laser or this or that, but not in the implications of using that equipment. And what, the geographic, strategic implications of space wars and how's this, really going to evolve one way or the other. And then I mentioned earlier, how do you define winning for space? Because it's mostly information, you're really denying an adversary information. And how do you model a potential adversary's mind of whether he had this information or not, he's going to make a different decision or not? That's kind of tough. And then I think fighting wars in space is better than the ground. And I know that's kind of a warmonger thing, but you're not going to get any human casualties. There's no reason to attack the International Space Station. Though I have to admit, I was talking to General Beer probably 35 years ago at a space conference where he stood up. This was in Colorado Springs, and they projected 100-foot wide American flag, and he put on this World War II uniform, and he gave us a tough talk like General Patton in the movie. And I talked to him later, and I says, well, if there was a Russian cosmonaut there on the space station and he has binoculars looking out the porthole and he sees the left hook, what would you do? And his response was, I'd shoot him. Well, I'm not sure about discharging a gun on the space station, putting holes in the side and all that. But I think there's really no reason to attack it. I doubt there's secret space weapons on there because there's too many countries there. And they have lifeboats. They can always just escape if they think it's getting too hot up there. And then, you're not destroying cities or ground structures. There's all kinds of anti-satellite weapons that do not create debris. I have a whole briefing on that, 90 different ways to attack satellites without generating debris. And then you sort of can reconstruct on the ground relatively quickly. But for space, it takes a long time to build new satellites and launch them, and you give them months on orbit to check them out and things like that. So you could maybe ruin an adversary's space war-making capability for years, especially if you take out their launch sites, which is kind of an issue too, because there's all these corrosive fuels and things there. So you want to make sure you're not attacking the fuel sites and that there's a city nearby. There'd be a poison cloud coming out of it. But the other problem too is with space is it's almost like the nuclear war, you use it or lose it. if a war is over with in 24 hours and space is kind of obscure and you're sitting around self-deterring, saying, well, I think we were attacked, I'm not sure, I can't counterattack until we're sure, and that's going to take days, weeks, months, you've lost the war in 24 hours. So does that mean it's sort of the hair trigger, like nuclear war, attack first? There's, you probably don't have too much in the way of war reserves. There's, something might be over with too fast. So that's unstable in one sense. And you might cause a space war through ignorance or fears or something like that. And I've mentioned the most of these earlier. And then there's a document that the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States puts out, JP 5-0, and that's how the U.S. fights wars. And it's actually genius, And the best thing about it is it says, before you start planning any sort of conflict, before you start deploying troops and doing this and that, and attacking and putting together courses of action, you list what are the war termination criteria. What would you do to stop the war? And then you back off from there. We need to conquer territory or take the capital, and so we need these many armored divisions, and you start figuring that out. Well, what about in space? What are the war termination criteria for space? That okay, we won the war, or we convince the other guy to stop doing whatever he's doing, either in space or even on the ground. We convince them we're very serious. We're willing to blow things up in space because we're so serious about what you're doing on the ground. So I put together, I think, about 50 possible space war termination criteria, because that's all planning really has to start from there. And I doubt anyone's thinking this yet. But these are some of the potential ones, and you can click on the briefing, there's more. So in summary, how to win or even how to lose a war. So how to win, we mentioned all of these: space awareness, positioning pre-conflict, decisive political will. You might have the greatest weapon systems and the greatest generals, but the politicians are going to hold them back, and hold them back until it's too late. So you have to be decisive, but then decisive might mean you're causing the space war by doing things too quickly. So that's a hard thing to figure. And then the other thing is, well, what's good space doctrine? We haven't had a really major space war. We've had, like I say, about 10 incidents. So how do you fight space wars? And, I've got all sorts of doctrine I put together, but who am I? Who knows? We don't really know. We don't have thousands of years of history, military history, and so forth. So maybe it's very difficult to figure out this is a good space general and this isn't, and so many of them are politicians instead of war fighters. Who's fighting the war? Is it a general, or is it some captain in a command center early in the morning where he's got to make a decision right then and there? And is it better to take out an adversary's imagery or his communication, or just over one part of the earth, so to speak? Should we all just do temporary kinds of things, or permanent kinds of attack? All of this, how do you kind of add that all up and figure it out and align it with what you're really trying to do is reshape the geopolitical environment afterwards? So you got to be careful what you're doing during the conflict. And then I already mentioned, well, how do you define winning? Gee, I don't know. So how to lose space war: uncertainty, confusion, self-deterrence. You've got all these great assets, and they're covering Europe, but they're not covering the Western Pacific. Have you really thought of, well, maybe you thought too much about future political impacts, and that sort of froze you of not doing what you really need to do right in today, in the next few hours. And then maybe the space war is lost on the ground, and I'll show you how in a minute. Okay, the war in space over the Ukrainian conflict. And Sun Tzu, all warfare is based on deception, even more so in space, because it's just difficult to see what's happening there. So, history, going back to 2014. In 20 February, the conflict starts in earnest. A whole bunch of people started getting killed. In 15 March, the Ukrainians, and this is, if you got this briefing, you can click on here and I'll show you the news announcement. They attempt to, what they call, decay a Russian communication satellite out of orbit. That's not exactly right. If it was a deasynchronous thing, it's not going to decay out of orbit, but maybe make it start changing its attitude or spinning or something like that. So I don't think they were able to do that, but that was a space attack. And I listed, that's a blue attack, And then on the 2nd of April, the entire Russian GLONASS, their GPS system, had a system-wide failure of all 24 satellites for 13 hours. I'll show you the orbital dynamics for that. And I don't think that was an attack to take out a Russian capability. That was a deterrence kind of attack, saying, you better be careful or we'll do more. And the Russians didn't get the message. So 2 weeks later, there's a whole nother attack in the same manner against 8 satellites. And then there's a bunch of other attacks, and I say, is it a blue attack or something? I don't know. A ballistic missile early-warning satellite suddenly stopped working. This is what I call a red attack. It's a diplomatic, economic attack, where the head of the Russian Space Agency, who was launching US astronauts to the International Space Station, said, oh, you can use a trampoline now to get up there. We're not going to launch you. So it's a threat. They didn't play out that threat, but that's part of space warfare. This is kind of my favorite. In 16 May, a Russian launch vehicle carrying a new telecommunications satellite that would have covered the eastern Ukraine, it crashed on a Chinese village on launch when Putin was there conducting a visit to Beijing to sell Russian space capabilities. Now, that's awfully circumstantial. I can't prove that was happening, but it's, it sounds like it. And then there's a bunch of other failed Russian satellites, statistically more than in the past. So I don't know if these intentional attacks or not. And then there was a launch failure out of Kourou in French Guiana, Kourou, or whatever. That was launching a Galileo, that's the European navigation satellite. And who knows if that was a warning to the Europeans to back off on the Ukrainian support. And then the granddaddy of them all, a Russian cyber attack on the American banking system in August. And and it was in the paper that 5 different US banks in Manhattan had a major cyber attack, and the bank said, oh, it looks like it was coming from Russian servers. And they were, they downloaded tens of millions of bank accounts, stock accounts, all this stuff. And then a few days later, you heard nothing about it. But suddenly, Obama stopped talking bad about the Russians. And a week later, a truce was signed, semi-truce for the Ukrainian thing. So I interpret that. Now, okay, I have a little additional information. Getting back to, let's see here, 2nd April, the loss of the GLONASS satellite systems. I was at the Pentagon around that time, job interviewing. And in a classified manner, they told me, oh, they were thinking of attacking some Russian satellites. And 4 days later, that happened. So for what that's worth, I interpret it to mean that the attacks were happening on the Russian satellites. The Russians got mad about the whole thing and brought the space war to the ground and attacked the American banking system and said, we're going to release all these bank accounts unless you guys stop this in space and in Ukraine and things like that. And it appears to have worked. So I interpret that to mean the US lost that space war in a sense. Now, let me go over the specifics and let's see, I've got enough time. This is a printed in the United Kingdom. This is a user location who was using a GLONASS receiver on the ground. And this is where he really was at but the GLONASS receiver kept telling him fake information that he was 40 clicks off in the English channel. So it was a cyber attack that made the maybe messed the clock on it or something that messed up the GPS signal. So it was, or not GPS, the GLONASS signal, so that it was worthless. And this is what the Russians published at this date and time. The pink and red is when their GLONASS satellites, here's the GLONASS satellite numbers, started blinking out. And it's like, well, I'm a rocket scientist. I have my orbital dynamics software. Let me see on Earth where these satellites were at this exact date and time to see, you know, what part of the world were they being attacked from. Well, lo and behold, Alice Springs, Australia. Every time a Russian GLONASS system satellite came over there, it stopped working. And this is my simulation that's showing you, okay, this is the Earth, this is Australia, Alice Springs. It's probably actually Pine Gap. And look that up, that's an NSA listening site since the 1960s. That was a, the Australians have made 3 movies about that, and more than likely some sort of cyber weapon got positioned there and started attacking these satellite systems. And so here's the orbits of the Russian GLONASS systems. When you see this dotted line, that means they're within view of Alice Springs. And the attack, I mean, I've been to these sites. The attack happened at 6:30 a.m. local Alice Springs time. And I know these guys, you know, they come in at 6 a.m., they get their coffee at 6:15, they do simulated attacks, and 6:30, they push the big red button, you know. And if there's more than one GLONASS satellite within view, they were attacked in numerical order, GLONASS 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I am going to switch over now to my orbital dynamics software. And I guess I have to reshare the screen. And let's see, that would be this. And hopefully people can see this screen. And this is the animation showing the exact date and time and how the satellites, when they came over, and this is, you know, their orbits. And when you see the line, that means they're within view of that ground site. And let me start this simulation again. So here's when they came in over Alice Springs. They got within view and got attacked, even though they were in different orbits. And this is a flat map view. So you can see just at dawn at 6:30 Alice Springs time. Here's one of the covering the Ukraine, one of the GLONASS satellites, and that will be attacked when it came over here. And this is looking up from Alice Springs, azimuth elevation, as the satellites come over and what they can view from the ground. And this is showing you the, you know, date and time, from this date and time when the future attacks, visibility at least, would occur. So let me, and that to me is the mathematical proof that this is, the attacks happened. It wasn't natural phenomena or anything like that. Okay, let me see if I can find my briefing again. And no, this. Okay. So this is more or less what I showed you in real time. Now, the US will probably tell you about its counter communication system that counters satellites. You could look it up and click on here and see what the counter communication system is capable of. It's run by the 4th Space Control Squadron. And this is pictures of them, and that's online. They'll tell you all about that. And they're based here in New Mexico, in Alamogordo, White Sands Missile Base. And I don't know if they were deployed about that time in Australia. I'm just theorizing there. And this is, again, on Google, what Pine Gap looks like. And again, there's been movies made on that and so forth. Okay, conclusions. The failures of 7 Russian satellite systems over 4 months was just statistically unusual, but I can't prove anything except for the GLONASS one. And, it's not natural because it occurred exactly at 6:30 a.m. It was in numerical order, like they were checking off a list. So I can, through orbital dynamics, prove that. Maybe it was from the counter communication system. The other attacks are circumstantial. And again, that's the beauty of space. We can't prove something, plausible deniability, non-attribution, but everybody knows, at least at the government level, what was happening. I had mentioned the Galileo attack might have been a warning to the Europeans. The attack on the American banking system essentially won the space war, appears to me. So that's, again, you have to think strategically: space, ground, air, sea, land. These things are all linked. And then I think that's one of the reasons for the panic in the US and other nations that influenced the establishment of the Space Force. But the French told me in 2017 there was something even worse that happened. So, lessons learned. Okay, well, the GLONASS attacks were too obvious. They could have been done from mobile systems in the South Atlantic, on embassy rooftops around the world. So somebody like me couldn't just use unclassified information and detect that, oh, this really happened. So they don't really understand how to do space wars in a subtle way. But the other problem is the whole point was not to take out GLONASS, but was to send a message. And so the message has got to be obvious to the recipient. And if it's too obscure, people in their government say, oh, that's solar flares or, weather or something that's doing it. You got to make sure that it's pretty obvious if it's something that you're trying to send a message. So I'm mentioning this again. Space is always strategic by definition and very political. You got to put that into your planning. There could be terrestrial consequences to what you do in space, militarily, economically, politically, diplomatically. You have to be thinking the combined arms. Oh, I got this great anti-satellite and blow up a satellite. Well, maybe it should be combined with a cyber weapon. Maybe a cyber weapon fixes the satellite in space in that it jams any signals, or ground controller can't turn on self-defense mechanisms, and waits for an actual ASAT to come in, maybe an inspector satellite, to start, messing with it and things like that. I mean, you can combine these various techniques, but you have to understand the consequences. And then you really should try to get the State Department. I don't know, the politics with that is hard to figure. Okay, what happened in 2022? And I have this quote too from a friend of mine who's now deceased, Major General Roger Cook. He says satellites have no mothers, and that's important. That you can get away with a lot. There's a lot less political, maybe, ramifications of war in space versus killing troops and civilians on the ground, where you're going to have a lot of people upset. Where if a satellite stops working in space and I can still get my cable TV, I don't really care. Is probably the attitude of 99% of the people. Oh, and this is some satellites I drew of potential satellite inspector killer satellites coming up close. It's all theoretical. So what's happening now? The war in space. Well, thankfully, not much. I don't know if the Russians, they attacked their own satellite a few months back. Well, it's probably more 7 or 8 months back now, as a warning, an obvious warning. And they attacked a satellite one of their dead satellites in sun-synchronous orbit, which is the same orbit used by National Reconnaissance Office, imagery birds and all. So that was an obvious threat. A week later, this Russian space office says, and we've got weapons to go against GPS too. So these were obviously threats. And again, I'm not cleared into the classified aspects of this, but there's been no real space attacks that I've been able to detect. Now, there was major attacks on the ground. The Viasats experienced all kinds of service interruptions, and that was being used by Ukrainian forces. So it was an obvious Russian attack against the ground terminals. And I don't know how they did this, but tens of thousands of ground terminals for Viasat across Europe physically broke. Somehow a cyber attack was able to physically break them. And so there was issues like windmills stopped working in Western Europe and things like that. So there's kind of spillover effects. And then there's, supposedly an attack on Starlink satellites that was fixed and so forth. And then there's this sort of diplomatic things, space agency refusing to launch UK satellites. It was sitting there, I don't know, in Kazakhstan or something like that, sitting there on the launch stand, the rockets there, the satellites on board, and the Russians suddenly say, "Oh, we're just not going to launch this, and you can't get it back." So it's just diplomatic, economic kinds of attacks. In some sense, the U.S. using or allowing to be used Starlink in imagery information, and I'm sure passing military information from signals intelligence to the Ukrainians, is using space in the war in one way or the other. And I don't know if the commercial satellite operators really understand all that. Well, you're part of the kill chain now. That means I think you're a legal target. I mean, I mentioned earlier using Intelsat when we had drones, we still do now and again over Afghanistan, that they communicate via Intelsat back to the United States. Well, if there's an Intelsat ground receiver terminal or controller terminal in France, does that make those French personnel legal targets because they're part of the kill chain? They're helping kill people in Iraq or in the old days in Afghanistan and in Ukraine and all that. So I think people have to think that through a little better. So that's about all I had. These are additional things and all that. I mentioned I have this 21,000 member space warfare discussion group. You're welcome to become a part of that group. If you want, just send me your name, rank, if you have one, organization, and email address, and I could put you on that. There's weekly emails that go out there. So are there any questions? Let me stop the share. Okay, no questions. Thank you for your time. And I will